Room for One by Frederick Cowles. It was really rather foolish of me to decide to take a tramping holiday in Cornwall during the month of October. But beggars can't be choosers, and I had been engaged on a new book all through the summer and had to see it through the press before I could even think of a holiday. I passed the final proofs on October the 1st, and there and then made up my mind to pack a few things in a rucksack and go down to Bude. From there, I planned to walk round the coast to Penzance. Cornwall is an ideal country in the summertime, when the moors are green with bracken, the sea is quiet and friendly, and the rugged cliffs gleam in the sunshine as the fairies dance round the holy wells. But with the coming of autumn, it seems that the good fairies abandon Cornwall to unfriendly spirits. The moorlands become treacherous black bogs, white mists swirl up from the sea, and the cliffs are like giants ready to devour whatever comes their way. I tramped from Bude to Boscastle and on to Wadebridge, and each hour I regretted my foolhardiness more and more. I spent a couple of days at Newquay, and then, determined in a pig-headed fashion to stick to my plans, I set off for St Ives. The interesting church and holy well at Cubert claimed my attention, and I lingered there longer than I should have done. By the time I got to St Agnes, it was already afternoon, and I still had another 16 miles or so to journey before I reached my destination. The map showed that the cliff road would knock off at least 4 miles, but there was always a chance that by keeping to the main highway, I might be able to get a bus. On inquiring at St Agnes, this proved to be a forlorn hope. After the summer season, the bus service had been considerably curtailed, and only one bus a day passed through the village, and that had left at 2 o'clock. So without asking advice on the matter, I decided to follow the cliff road. For the first few miles, it certainly was a road, and then, without any warning, it became little better than a grass track. The going was very hard, and the silence began to get on my nerves. Here and there, the abandoned shaft of some old mine raised its jagged point to the sky, and an occasional stunted tree looked like a hideous witch brooding over the sea. Birds screeched mournfully, and the lapping waves made a music far from pleasant. I cursed myself for a fool, but it was too late for regrets, and I trudged on. It was getting dusk when the accident happened. I was walking at a good pace when I stepped into a crevice and twisted my ankle. I went blind with pain for a moment, and half fainting, dragged myself to a mound at the side of the path. The ankle swelled at an alarming rate, and a bandage, hastily improvised from a couple of handkerchiefs, was worse than useless. There was I, out on the cliffs between St Agnes and St Ives, faced with the prospect of spending the night in that bleak spot, with not even a bush to serve as shelter. I tried to hobble on, but progress was impossible. I made myself as comfortable as I could, but the pain was agonizing. The sea was at least 200 feet below, and there was not a drop of water handy to give my ankle relief. I lay there, almost numb with cold, praying for some good Samaritan to come my way. I must have fallen asleep, for when I next looked at the luminous dial of my wristwatch, it was 11:15, and far away out at sea, a red light was winking on some boy. It was then that I heard the chug-chug of a motor. It never occurred to me to wonder how a car could be travelling along the cliff road. Nearer and nearer came the sound, and 2 yellow lights gleamed through the darkness. With a great effort, I struggled to my feet and stood in the path of the oncoming vehicle, shouting and waving my arms. It pulled up with a grinding of brakes, and I was able to make out that it was an old-fashioned motor coach, evidently taking a party of roisterers home. It was full of people, and they were all singing a most dismal song. "Can you give me a lift to St. Ives?" I shouted. The driver, who seemed to be muffled up to his eyes in a great cloak, leaned from his seat and in a queer, high-pitched voice answered, "Room for 1." I pulled myself up the steps of the coach, and the passengers stopped their singing and turned their heads to watch me, but not one of them offered to give me a hand. The vacant seat was in front, and I fell into it just as the coach, with an awful rattle, started off again. I turned to my neighbour with a word of apology for my clumsiness, but he, like the driver, seemed to be muffled in a scarf or cloak, and all I could see of him were 2 eyes that glowed in a strangely phosphorescent manner. It was then that I became aware of the smell. At first, I thought it was bad fish. But although I caught traces of the dank odour of seaweed, the stench was worse than the most rotten fish could ever emit. Something cold and slimy touched my neck. I put my hand up and removed it. It was a tiny crab. And something else touched me. It was the hand of my neighbour on the seat, and it was even colder than the crab had been. With claw-like fingers, I felt him push back my coat sleeve and pinch the flesh of my arm. Another cold and bony hand came from behind and felt my neck. And all the time, the rotten odour of corruption was getting stronger. Either the interior of the coach suddenly became lighter, or my eyes became accustomed to the gloom, for at that moment I found myself able to see something of the features of my travelling companions. Merciful God, grant that I never gaze upon such a sight again. I was in the company of the dead. What I had taken to be scarves about their necks were hundreds of mussels and barnacles clinging in ghastly collars. The faces of these men were eaten away, the flesh hung in mouldering shreds, and crabs wriggled in the hollows where eyes should have been. With a shriek, I tried to rise from my seat, but those fleshless hands held me down. I kicked and struggled. I felt their fingers snap like rotten wood as I managed to break loose and dash for the door. I was actually on the steps when the hands grabbed my rucksack and tried to pull me back. I slipped my arms from under the straps, and as I did so, the steps seemed to crumble under me, and I was hurled out onto the road. Half stunned by the fall and dazed by the pain in my ankle, I lay there for some moments, raising my head just in time to see that terrible motor coach with its ghastly load hang for a second over the cliff and then plunge down into the sea. Never shall I forget the hopeless cry that floated up to me as the thing struck the rocks below. I must have fainted again, for I remember nothing more until I felt someone shaking me. It was morning by then, and a coastguard was bending over me. With his help, I managed to limp the 3 miles to his cottage, and from there he telephoned for a car to take me to St. Ives. From the coastguard, I ascertained the following facts. Over 12 years before, a party of men from the village of St. Erlid, just beyond St. Ives, chartered a motor coach to take them on an excursion to Newquay. The picnic became a drunken rout, and on the return journey none of the company, not even the driver, was sober. That was before the new main road was made, and the coach returned by the cliff road. About 7 miles from St. Ives, whilst the company were all singing tipsy songs, the vehicle plunged over the cliff, and not one of the party escaped death. One other queer thing I must record. My rucksack was returned to me a few days later. It had been found on the rocks in the exact place where the coach had gone over 12 years before.